carbon neutrality. Thank you, Zoom. Thank you for your interest in carbon neutrality at the University of Michigan. I'm Adam Fisher. I'm U of M's Sustainability Communications Manager, and welcome to an informational session presented by the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, the PCCN. This event, as the invite suggested, it's designed for those in the UM community who are less familiar with the university's work on climate change and carbon neutrality, but would like to learn more. So whether you've been following the PCCN or not, whether you've been following broader carbon neutrality work at the university or not, whether or not you've had the chance to review the Commission's draft reports, you're in the right place. This information session is an introduction. It will provide a high-level overview of carbon neutrality, the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, its process, and its draft recommendations. Since February 2019, the Commission has worked to identify scalable, transferable, and financially responsible pathways for the University of Michigan to achieve net zero carbon emissions at all 3 U of M campuses and Michigan Medicine. Joining us today to walk through this overview are the co-chairs of the President's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, Professors Jennifer Haverkamp and Stephen Forrest. Jennifer Haverkamp is the Graham Family Director of the Graham Sustainability Institute and Professor from Practice at the Law School. Stephen Forrest is the Peter A. Franken Distinguished University Professor of Engineering, Paul G. Goebel Professor of Engineering, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, Professor of Material Science and Engineering, and Professor of Physics. Thank you both for joining us today. Before handing it off to Professor Forrest, I want to mention a few quick guidelines. First, a significant portion of today's forum will be dedicated toward Q&A, and some of you have submitted questions when signing up. Thank you for those. We also encourage you to submit questions during the event, as I'm sure some may just pop into your heads during the presentations upcoming. Second, as Zoom just notified us, this event will be recorded in case you would like to refer to this later. The Commission will eventually post on its website a link to this video. However, the closed captioning process takes a little bit of time. You see some live captions in here. We'll get an actual transcription as well. That may take a couple days, but it will be posted as soon as we can. Finally, I'd be remiss if not to mention that the Commission encourages you to take 2 actions. One, read the report, and you can find it at sustainability.umich.edu/carbon neutrality, and through kind of a navigation panel on the left side once you get to that page. And again, it's sustainability.umich.edu/carbon neutrality. You can go to read the report through a formal documents section. There's also a link to the public comment portal where you can submit comments. The public comment period is open till January 26th. So we encourage you to get those in soon. There will be links and QR codes at the end of the presentation, so you'll all be able to refer to them that way as well. So with all that said, I'll sit back and let the co-chairs introduce the Commission, and I look forward to an interesting and informative session. Again, thank you all for joining, and Steve, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, thank you, Adam, and thank you all for joining. I'm going to, so for the first 35, 40 minutes, we will summarize, Jennifer and I will summarize what the Commission has recommended, what our structure is, and the various details of the process. After that, as Adam said, we will turn this over to you for questions. I am the projectionist, as is our habit, and so you'll hear Jennifer cueing me when to change her presentation materials, but the way it's going to flow is that she's going to introduce the Commission and the problem. Then I will go through the recommendations, and I will hand it back to Jennifer to talk in some detail about a very complex issue, and that is the one of offsets. So that is the intention today, and I think you should be seeing my slides. So Jennifer, if you want to start, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, Adam, for the introduction, and thanks all of you for taking the time to join us today. I think I speak on behalf of the entire Commission as well as my co-chair and I in appreciating the level of interest and the seriousness with which the community has received this report. A lot of people put a lot of work into it. Some people have followed the process closely, but as you'll see from our presentation, the scope of these recommendations really affect everyone across the university community. So our goal is to make sure that broad swath of the community is aware of what's going on and understands what it is that our commission is bringing forward as recommendations, and has the opportunity during this comment period to help shape our final report. Next slide, please. So the first question might be, why are we doing this? Why has President Schlissel made this one of the top priorities of his second term? I think a lot of you probably have followed the news about climate change and the science that's out there, but just to briefly recap some of it and a sense of the urgency. This slide shows a report that came out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a couple years ago, which is a global consortium of network of scientists all over. And the global goal is to get to carbon neutrality by mid-century. But the panel realized that if we could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees, which is what the mid-century target would do, we could greatly reduce some of the worst impacts of climate change. But to do so, there's an interim target there in 2030, consistent with only 1.5 degrees of warming, which is to, as you can see, almost cut in half the emissions that would otherwise be expected to be happening globally by 2030. Next slide. So some of the things that are important to think about is, again, for the urgency and the impact that we are expecting. Unfortunately, climate impacts are already happening in significant ways. There are intense storms, there are droughts, record-breaking heat in cities around the globe. Sea level rise is already measurable. You're seeing more snow, less snow, more rain, fish migrating north to escape warmer waters. Every year in the lives of the University of Michigan's undergraduates has been well above the 20th century average. 9 of the 10 warmest years have occurred just in the last 15 since 2005. I mentioned the IPCC report, some of the impacts that would be worsened if we limited warming to 2 degrees instead of 1.5. The loss of habitat for animals, plants, and insects would be 2 to 3 times greater. 37% of the population would be exposed to severe heat waves at least once every 5 years, which is 2.6 times worse than if we limit it to 1.5 degrees. And the Arctic permafrost thawing, which is releasing methane, which is itself a very potent greenhouse gas, would be 38% worse. Next slide. This initiative launched by President Schlissel is not the University of Michigan's first foray into addressing climate change. As far back as 1963, our central power plant was converted from coal to natural gas, which is cleaner, though still a fossil fuel. Some of our peer institutions are just now switching out their coal power plants. 15 years ago, we launched an energy management program, which has reduced the energy use by 17% in our buildings, even while we've massively grown the footprint of the campus by 2 million square feet. I guess that's not massive, but it's significant. And then there's an existing greenhouse gas reduction goal that the university is working toward and expects to meet. And that was set in 2011. And it is a 25% reduction in greenhouse gases from a baseline of 2006. And we are well on track to meet that. The two policies or two measures that are accomplishing that in particular are the purchased electricity agreement with DTE that the university entered into for half of our purchased electricity so that they would come from 100% renewables. And there is a wind power plant being built, I believe, on the Thumb to accomplish that. And the central power plant was expanded, is being expanded significantly, and that replaces the coal-heavy electricity that we purchase with cleaner electricity that's produced as a byproduct, frankly, of the heating, which is the main purpose of that power plant. And then our commission was launched. Next slide. So this is the mission that we were charged with, our commission, to contribute to a more sustainable and just world by creating approaches and solutions regarding our carbon emissions that are environmentally sustainable, involve the regional community, and create scalable and transferable models. The last being important to ensure that what we accomplish here is not just limited to the university, but has a much broader effect globally and through peer institutions and communities. Next slide. So what do we mean by carbon neutrality? At a global level, it means that there's a balance between the carbon that is emitted and that is absorbed from the atmosphere into carbon sinks. At the level of an institution like our university, it means that all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are attributable to our activities and that can be measured are either eliminated or they are offset, and that can be offset by investments in carbon credits, which we'll explain more later, or offset by projects that actually absorb and sequester the carbon. Next slide. The purposes that we were given were laid out in our mandate. They are to define a goal for and clarify parameters of carbon neutrality for the university, and to outline a timeline, pathway, and approaches for achieving the goal. And these principles that were included in our mandate have informed our work across the board, that they're environmentally sustainable, that they involve the regional community. I mentioned scalable and transferable models already. Also include the participation and the accountability of all the members of the community, and are financially responsible in the context of our broader missions of education, research, service, and patient care. Next slide. So this is a somewhat complex graphic, but it represents the structure that we set up to fulfill this mission that we were given. I think what's especially useful perhaps is the three boxes across the bottom that show the level of effort that has gone into this draft report. We hired external consultants to provide recommendations and analysis for in two key areas, the biggest one being what are the options to go carbon neutral across our heat and power infrastructure, such as the power plant. Another one on building energy efficiency. Then we, I think the bulk of the work really here was done by these internal analysis teams that were created. Each team was led by a faculty expert staffed by students, covering the list of topics there. You'll hear more about those in the recommendations that came out of our process. And then we also had subgroups and topics that we addressed commission-wide internally, such as the questions around carbon offsets, electrification of our fleet, things like that. All in all, well over 100 people have been involved in this process so far, including about 70 students. Next slide. This is the timeline we've been following. We are now happy to say that box on the far right bottom, the end of phase 3. We have put out our final report for public comment. Between now and sometime in mid to late February, we will be reviewing all the public comments, making the necessary revisions to our report, and delivering it to President Schlissel. Next slide. Some terminology that will be helpful as you listen to the recommendations and the rest of our presentation is how the emission scopes are defined. Greenhouse gas emissions are generally understood for an institution to fall into 3 different categories. And what these are here, scope 1, are the emissions that we produce ourselves. So those are from things like our power plant, the boilers that we have on the North Campus, elsewhere in Ann Arbor, and also on the campuses in Dearborn and Flint, the emissions out of our buses, our maintenance equipment, that sort of thing. Scope 2 is basically purchased electricity. It's the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by wherever we purchase our electricity from. For us, mostly it's consumers in DTE. Scope 3 is everything else. And this is a somewhat amorphous category. It's rather difficult to measure because it's all the emissions that you could attribute to activities at the university, but are not directly produced by us. So that includes things like people commuting to and from work, the emissions from airplanes when we travel for university work. It includes all the emissions from the food that are purchased and bought and eaten across the campuses and other purchased goods. The scope here is really very broad because our new target that we're trying to set is for, as Adam said, all 3 campuses and Michigan Medicine. And we are also trying to measure and make recommendations into scope 3, which was not part of the original 2025 goal and is not something that a lot of our peer institutions have also put into their targets so far. Next slide. So this graphic shows some of how we tried to think about these 3 scopes of emissions as we set about developing recommendations for how to control them. The basic message here is that it's hard to control something if you can't measure it and you don't have control over it. So the y-axis is basically showing from bottom to top our ability to confidently estimate emissions levels. And we have high confidence in the amount of emissions that are coming out of things like our power plant, our fleet. Sorry, that was the y-axis. The x-axis goes across in terms of our ability to directly influence those emissions levels. And as you can see, some of the hardest to influence are things like general purchasing, food purchasing, where because all of those scope 3 emissions of ours are actually somebody else's scope 1 emissions, whoever is making the food, whoever is producing the paper, the computers, they actually have a lot more control over what those emissions are, though we fully appreciate the leverage that we as a large university have over procurement and ability to try to move our suppliers in that direction. And I think with that slide, I turn it over to you, Steve, right?
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer. So what Jennifer has just laid out is really the process we went through. What I'm going to spend a bulk or the rest of my time on is to tell you what the product of our deliberations have been. And they have been intense. We have tried to be as well informed as we can, as you have seen through the internal analysis teams and through external consultants. But ultimately, it was up to us as a group to provide recommendations, and we're still in the process of that. These, remember, are draft recommendations, which is why we are having this meeting and listening to you. But to provide a set of feasible recommendations to the administration that they can act upon. So just to remind you, Jennifer has gone through this before, but I think it is really our guiding light. It comes from our charge. These are the principles that we had to take into consideration when making each of our recommendations. Again, they have to be sustainable. There has to be an equity and justice component to every recommendation. We wanted and insisted on having regional community involvement. Very important for the University of Michigan is if we make changes here, it doesn't really change the global environment measurably. But if our methods that we come up with are scalable and transferable, people can learn from us, and of course we can learn from them. So this was also a very important guiding principle. Again, we wanted to have community participation and accountability. Jennifer has explained some of that, and of course, financially responsible. The University of Michigan is a large institution with priorities of education, research, service, and of course, healthcare. And we have to balance all of those against the incredibly important issue of climate change through our carbon neutrality. So with that, I want to first of all talk about the recommendations for Scope 1 emissions. Recall that Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that we are directly responsible for. And this pie chart shows that 98% of our Scope 1 emissions come from our natural gas, burning of natural gas. And just a small fraction, 2%, go to transportation fuel. So for the bus system, the fleets, and the various equipment that we have on campus. It's also important to keep in mind that natural gas is the primary source for heating and cooling the university. 83% of our natural gas is dedicated to that, and the balance is for electricity generation. So really, electricity generation is almost a byproduct of our central power plant. This divides it up a little better. These are our sources. There's a plant up on North Campus Research Complex that generates 12% of our natural gas emissions. The boilers, 23%, and the central power plant, which is visible to everybody on Huron Street, is 65%. And there on the right, you can see the uses of these sources. And as I mentioned, electricity is a fairly small fraction of the total. So with that, let me dig in immediately to the Scope 1 and 2 neutrality goals. These are the draft recommendations. It's always important to keep in mind that these are still in draft form. The commission is still meeting. We are taking in community comments and taking them all seriously and trying to understand how we can include the concerns of the larger community in our final report, which, as Jennifer also said to remind you, is due in February, late February. So our draft recommendation is to commit to the goal of carbon neutrality inclusive of carbon offsets for Scope 1 emissions, those we generate, across all three campuses by 2025. Again, I'm going to table the whole discussion about offsets until the end because there's a certain amount of complexity, and Jennifer will handle that for you. Prioritize direct emissions reductions. Excuse me for my dry throat. Prioritize direct emissions reductions for Scope 1 by setting a goal of eliminating them across all three campuses by 2040 and exceeding science-based targets. Those are the IPCC targets that we discussed right at the outset via direct emissions reductions, i.e. without offsets along the way. So this is what I call, just for brevity, I call this is our technological goal date. That is when we can really eliminate all emissions on campus ourselves without offsets by 2040, and commit to carbon neutrality for Scope 2 emissions across all three campuses by 2025 or earlier. That's purchased electricity. On our team, we have a carbon accounting group that's led by Greg Keolian. I think this is a truly powerful and unique group that we have been able to engage to help us understand how what our trajectory looks like compared to what is needed. So if we carry on business as usual, BAU, that's just doing what we do today and heading in the direction that we're heading. You can see we cut our CO2 emissions only by about 50% by 2050. There are some kinks in the curve here, which have to do with our purchased electricity being decarbonized. Our electricity suppliers have their own plans. We have a PPA, a power purchase agreement that's coming online, which will cut down the emissions quite dramatically, somewhere around 2022. Our trajectory from our plan is shown by the black line. Remember, our technological goal is to be done in 2040, so that brings us to zero at that point. Scope 1 emissions are a large fraction of that, the principal fraction of that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Scope 2, we can get there rather quickly, which is something I'll also talk about as well. That's purchased electricity. But without carbon accounting, we will not hit the target dates that I showed in the recommendation. So that's going to require carbon offsetting, and that is the green filled up zone between 2025 and 2040. Again, we will return to that at the end. So what are we recommending? As I mentioned, a huge fraction of our Scope 1 emissions are really dedicated to heating buildings and cooling buildings in an environment which is not particularly friendly, and therefore is very carbon cost inefficient. That is, we're living in the upper Midwest, where we have many months of cold air, and we have to deal with that. And of course, natural gas is our current way of heating and cooling. And the other thing that you have to remember is that this is a campus that really has buildings that go back 150 years. Of course, we have newer sectors and older sectors. The way that we have found to be the most direct path to supplying carbon-free heating and cooling is through geo-exchange, exchanging heat with the earth. This will require about 20,000 boreholes be drilled around campus and campus environs in which we can exchange the heat from the buildings. It would be the largest geo-exchange project on the planet, and it is expensive. And it's kind of the elephant in the room. We're talking about $3.5 billion, and it takes time. You cannot just do this immediately. So our best estimate is by 2040, we can have the project done without disrupting the campus in a way that causes damage to our other priorities and mission. And it may not even be possible to do it faster than that. Now, people get very afraid of the large price tag and so on. Remember, it's stretched over 2 decades. And the other thing to remember is the technology, we live in this is a theme I want to recall through all of this. We live in a very dynamic environment. Technology is changing very rapidly, so that there will be other approaches we can use to perhaps beyond geo-exchange that will intercede as we go through this process, so we can maybe geo-exchange in part of the campus and not others, and as a new technology comes in. And of course, we expect that the prices will drop with time as well. So this is a snapshot in time. We want to, of course, convert UM's entire vehicle fleet, automobiles, trucks, buses, etc. It's not a big fraction of the total carbon that we emit, as I mentioned before. On the other hand, it is very visible and shows that we are committed as a culture to changing our carbon footprint in a very proactive way. The easiest and earliest thing that we can do is get rid of Scope 2 emissions by purchasing our electricity from renewable sources. And that's something we can do in the very near term, and it's very doable, and it's actually fairly cost effective. There are other recommendations here that I can go through about buildings, about a revolving energy fund, and carbon pricing systems that also make our progress towards Scope 1 and 2 emissions much faster. But I'll just leave those up there and refer you to the report for more details. These are, by the way, only a small fraction of the total recommendations that we have on all of our topics. And there's a lot of depth and thinking that went into each of these things. So moving on to scope 3, as Jennifer inferred, our scope 3 emissions are somebody else's scope 1 and 2 emission. And since there is a building pressure, and now it looks like governmental pressure as well, for everybody to go down this pathway, although this is a very tough nut to crack because we don't have much control, I think we can rest assured that our scope 3 emissions will be reduced with time as other institutions, companies, industries also reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So those are our suppliers. But by no later than 2025, we want to set carbon neutrality goal dates for each of the scope 3 emission categories recommended for inclusion by the Commission. Recognizing that goal dates may vary by category based on UM's ability to measure and influence the associated emissions categories. If we can't measure it, we can't affect it. So that really becomes a primary activity going forward. The Commission also recommends that in 2025 and at regular subsequent intervals, actively consider including additional scope 3 categories in its goals if the university can accurately measure and reasonably influence emissions in that category. In setting carbon neutrality goal dates for scope 3 emissions, we want to establish targets inclusive of offsets that are more aggressive than the science-based targets, which is the 2050 date, and reach neutrality no later than 2040. I should say, and I think it's worth drawing your attention to this, that in terms of the number of categories we have placed in scope 3, the way we're attacking scope 1 and 2 go very much beyond what has been recommended by other universities, although we think that those our peer institutions and so on will move in these directions as well. So these, I think the point here I'm making is these are not just window dressing. These are very, very serious, going really deep into our operations, how to reduce our emissions. So just a few of our draft recommendations: reform parking policy on each of UM's 3 campuses and reduce or eliminate incentives for personal vehicle commuting. I have often heard that the University of Michigan Ann Arbor campus consists of 40,000 people, all of them looking for a parking space. So this is a big nut to crack as well. Embrace flexible commuting options. And we have seen in the COVID crisis that we can change very rapidly. We can change our behavior if the crisis demands it. Well, this crisis of climate change is an existential one, so we must change. But telecommuting can't be a one size fits all. We have to do this with some nuance and find out the best way to make that happen, but we're pretty assured that the mechanisms exist to greatly expand that. Then there's issues where we're a constantly growing campus, and we know that the embodied carbon and the carbon emitted by buildings is quite a large generator of our total emissions. So we want to make sure that we take into consideration how we build buildings and how we meet our additional space needs that are carbon efficient. And again, there are others. I think food procurement is a very important area, and how we eat, what is our diet, and so on is also very important. So we've looked at all of these considerations. So then we come to the last thing that I will talk about before handing it back to Jennifer. Is this problem is a problem that will exist in perpetuity. So therefore, it's going to be much longer than you or I are going to be at this university. We will have many changes of the Board of Regents and presidents and so on. So it's extraordinarily important that we embed a culture of carbon neutrality in the long term into the university. And we have some examples of that. Diversity, equity, inclusion initiative is one in which that became a priority of the university, and there is now a culture arising that can effectively sustain the values of that particular objective long into the future. So we need to do the same with carbon neutrality. It is truly the most existential threat in our lifetimes and the lifetime of the planet. So to institutionalize this commitment, we want to have a high-placed office which reports directly to the president, whoever that president is. That is the Carbon Neutrality Office, just for search of a better word. But having a person in an office at a high level is not enough. It has to be, it has to send out its tentacles and be part of every unit across the entire university and across all three campuses. And that is the most important piece of what we can do to sustain our efforts into the future. We believe that the University of Michigan is a powerful research engine, one of the most powerful in the entire world. We have many faculty who are dedicated to technologies that impact directly carbon neutrality and also social science and political science and so on, that all policy, that all have impact in this realm. And therefore, it's really important that we self-invest in research in a significant way, that we are part of the solution. And then, of course, there's the curriculum. There's visible learning living lab initiatives that we have in mind, and so on. And finally, and very importantly, is we need to set up a network of organizations, municipalities, the state, and so on, that we can exchange ideas and work in a coherent way to move toward carbon neutrality. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer.
Thank you, Steve. Bear with us, folks. We're almost done, and then we'll switch over to your questions, trying to answer your questions. But as you saw from the graphic Steve showed with the big green area under the curves, the issue of carbon offsets and what role they might play in achieving our goals is a fairly important and complex question. So wanted to spend a little more time on that with you. First, what is a carbon offset? And here's a definition up on the screen. It's when an organization counterbalances its direct emissions. Instead of some specific emissions, or while awaiting the chance to reduce those emissions, the organization goes out beyond its own borders, beyond its campus, to find emission reductions elsewhere that are not otherwise required to happen. So it, by purchasing them, by investing them, makes those emission reductions happen to balance out the emissions within its own organization. It's important that these emission reductions are rigorous, verifiable. I'll talk about that more in a moment. It can be in the form of avoiding the release of emissions, or it can be in the form of biosequestration projects like planting trees that absorb emissions out of the air. And it can be anywhere on the planet. Next slide. So a little more of our thinking around the role of offsets here. As Steve was explaining, with the technological challenges of getting our emissions from our campuses actually reduced is quite costly, quite challenging. 2040 is an ambitious date for us to do that by, but recognizing the sense of urgency around the problem, the commission felt that we should have a much earlier goal date, and to achieve that goal date, some form of offsetting would be necessary. So, and we then spent a fair amount of time thinking about how do we set some discipline and rigor around what that offsetting would be. And our recommendation has criteria, minimum criteria for offsets. That's the first bullet here. That all the offset investments the university makes should be real, measurable, additional, permanent, avoiding leakage, verified, enforceable, compliant with social and environmental safeguards. These are criteria that a lot of institutions use, and there's a general understanding about what that means and what kind of offsets would or would not meet those criteria. Additionality is especially important. This is the idea that if you've gone out and reduced emissions somewhere, they don't just pop out somewhere else. Like you may be paying for some trees to be planted, but if down the road a forest is cut down, you haven't really done much to reduce the emissions in that area. And it's also the case, how do you make sure that what you are doing is why the emission reductions happened instead of there's reductions that would have eventually happened anyway. So co-benefits are an important factor that we think the university should consider as it defines their reductions. Thank you, Steve. You know, there are factors like making sure that the kinds of offsets that the university uses do not have adverse environmental justice implications. To maybe you want to prioritize the projects being in your local region, for instance, or that they have biodiversity and nature protection benefits, things like that. Speaking of nature protection, one of the related recommendations we have is to look for opportunities on the University of Michigan's own lands where there's significant carbon sequestration potential and realize that. Now, those wouldn't exactly be offsets because they'd be within our own borders and part of our own carbon footprint, but also an important way to reduce our emissions. There are a lot of unknowns around the world of carbon offsets, not just, well, there are a lot of offsets that are questionable. There are some high quality offsets for sure. And the supply of those over time might change. An awful lot of organizations and companies are setting carbon neutrality goals and counting on offsets to be part of how they achieve those goals. So where the market goes in the next several years is an important question in terms of availability of supply of high quality offsets. So we felt as a commission that we couldn't at a moment in time snapshot now foresee all of those questions. So one of our key recommendations in the offset area is that the university should establish a standing expert committee to review this guidance that we recommend, routinely update it, revise it, confer with experts, develop clear guidance for the university. And then it could also be the body that periodically puts out calls for proposals for entities to come forward with proposed projects or proposed offsets that could be used by the university. And with that, I think we've thrown an awful lot at you. Hope that it was digestible, and really look forward to Adam sharing with us some of your key questions so we can try to work through them. Thanks.
And if I could make one more statement before Adam signs on, is that if you have substantive recommendations that the commission consider, please make sure that you use our comment portal. What you say here, et cetera, is being recorded, and of course we will be taking notes, but when it gets in the portal, it will be dealt with one way or another. So please use that. And maybe I stole your thunder, Adam, but I want to leave you with that thought.
Thanks, Steve. And you didn't steal my thunder. You put it obviously better than I could have. Thank you, both of you, Steve and Jennifer, for that nuanced, interesting, and broad overview of all things PCCN. I have a number of questions coming in. Feel free to continue submitting questions throughout. We'll be monitoring throughout. So far, just for full transparency, we have about 20. So hoping with the remaining time, we can address as many as we can. To kick us off, and this question, I would posit to both of you, but let's go with Steve first. And it's on the broad overview of the draft report. Steve, you detailed kind of the high-level takeaways and the high-level recommendation tables. But this question says that the report is 135 pages. What areas should I focus on to get the gist of it? Or should I read the entire thing? And I'll expand that question to say, what are the areas that affect typical members of the U of M community directly that they should know about?
That's a great question. And I would say, yes, you should read the whole thing, but I understand that everybody has interests and they have a limited amount of time. For you, and by the way, almost every one of the recommendations that we place are going to have significant cultural and day-to-day impact on everyone on campus. And it's important that every one of us take our own actions in our own lives to limit carbon. But to give you a more direct answer to your question, I think that to be most effective, you should focus on the areas of the report that you think are most interesting. If you find them interesting, it probably means that you know that that's going to affect you the most. And we will, and you should not feel that you have to comment on everything, but really when you have a serious interest in something, focus on that, and there might be one or two or three topics that are particularly interesting. You know, for me, university travel is very important because I travel a lot. And so I want to know, and I know that to put a person up at 30,000 feet for the hours we spend in an airplane, it takes a lot of carbon, and it's the only way we can do that. So, you know, that interests me in the report. Another thing that interests me in the report is my specialty is renewable energy and lighting. So of course, I'm going to be interested in those things, the scope 1 emissions part, and scope 2 emissions. So again, I would really encourage everyone in the community to just try not to do everything. Do what really interests you and you feel you can contribute to.
If I could just very briefly add to that, I would answer the question a little bit differently, whether you're trying to read it now to comment on it or read it after it comes out to know what we decided, because the final report will have an executive summary that should help. At this point, I think what you should focus on depends a little bit about what role you play in the university community. If you're a student who does a lot of on-campus dining, you'll be very interested in the food recommendations. If you're a member of the faculty, staff, or student who commute some distance to campus and utilize university parking, that's a very immediate impact on your daily life. If you're someone in facilities and operations, look at the recommendations we're making in that area. If you are faculty, how would we affect the curriculum? How can we really incorporate more carbon neutrality understanding across our student body so that when they graduate, they take this mission out beyond the University of Michigan through the rest of their lives? Thanks.
And one last thing, just so I can chip in one last thought on this. If you're in development, there are donors out there who are very interested in certain aspects of having the university be more carbon neutral, to play a greater role in our ability to change the dynamics, to contribute directly in research, for example, or in our systems or in our education. So in development, you might want to look at things having to do with education, with research, and with just the university community in general. So it really is a matter of perspective.
Thank you both. Our next question is more of a process one, and I'll pose it to Jennifer first. What happens next? Are these recommendations for carbon neutrality already on the region's schedule for discussion? And if so, for when? And let's expand that to talk about how you foresee this process going forward.
Sure. As we mentioned in our presentation, these are recommendations from our commission to the president and to the regents. He'll share it with the regents. So I think that they have also been following this process and looking at the draft report. So the final report, when it lands on his desk, won't be a surprise immediately. But I think that there will be some process there for them to evaluate which of these recommendations they might be able to implement immediately, which ones they need to do more study. Some of the cost implications of these will be things that they'll want to study carefully. But the visibility of this effort and this as I said at the beginning, the priority that the president has placed on this, I think means that this is being taken very seriously. The level of public interest is showing that it's something that's being taken very seriously. And as Steve was mentioning, the structures that we recommend for evaluating and implementing this plan, we consider especially important to ensure, especially if you have something with a multi-decade implementation process, it has to survive the current, not only the current student body, but the current president and the current regents. So it has to be really built into the university's ethos.
Yeah, if I can say something on that too, as Jennifer says, the process has to be evergreen. Now, the one thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are a lot of recommendations here. We've shown you many of them, and there's a lot of detail under the recommendations that give guidance and so on. It's important to keep in mind that the university has many priorities, and it has to work this into the scheme of balancing priorities and implementing the various recommendations in a way. So phasing becomes very important. That's the word I'm looking for. It's phasing of the recommendations becomes very important so that we get the most done the earliest, and that the recommendations do not start to conflict with each other due to limited funding or whatever else it is. So all of those things really need to be discussed and taken up at the highest levels of the university. This is why we have recommended the institution of an executive leadership position in this area and an office that can make sure that these priorities are really looked at hard and are pursued with a great deal of energy very quickly. And so I think there's nobody on the commission who doesn't agree that urgency is really top of mind and must remain top of mind for decades to come.
Thank you both. I just on the topic of urgency and executive leadership, I want to go to another question, and that's in what way could the new carbon neutrality office that is proposed in draft recommendations and that you spoke about, in what way could that be in alignment with DEI efforts at the university? Steve, we'll start with you since you just
okay. The way we have positioned this is that the executive leadership should report directly to the president. And the reason for that is so that it is highly visible to the other operational units within the university and the other vice presidents who really implement the day-to-day, the provost, the government relations, the vice president for research and so on. All of the building decisions and everything else, this person has to have access and visibility, and also the imprimatur from the president that this is a university priority, so that when we do build a new building standards carbon neutrality building standards will be part of the discussion and an essential part of the discussion that is not left as an afterthought, but is brought in at the beginning, not the end. Jennifer, you might have more to say.
Yeah, I would just add that this question about the relationship between the carbon neutrality institutional efforts and DEI, I think is a great question, because the two issues are really intertwined and interdependent, or we won't be successful. Several sources recommended that we look at how the university has used the DEI experience to try to really inculcate it across the university and make cultural shifts. And so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can draw on from our work in DEI. But as Steve was saying, the carbon neutrality has much more of an operational focus, perhaps. So we felt that this role needed to be not necessarily just under the provostial umbrella, but other operational aspects of the university as well. And I would imagine that as an implementation plan is put forward, the people working on carbon neutrality would have to be consulting regularly with the DE&I office.
Thank you both. I have a question about scope 3 categories and the urgency and timelines behind defining goal dates. Are there scope 3 categories that we could set emissions goals for in just a year or two and not necessarily wait until 2025? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. As we were saying, we want to know where we have a handle, which we can measure, and then when we have some good strategies for reducing those goals. We wrote the recommendation as by 2025 to very much leave open the possibility, and we hope probability, that some of these goal dates could be set earlier than that. There are some areas like the emissions from waste that we have a very good handle on, and quite a good process for managing waste. So that's one where we might be able to get a goal date sooner. But our first priority across all of scope 3 is really getting an effective accounting system in place.
Thank you, Jennifer. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say too that, so waste is an obvious one. I think another one that we certainly know how to measure, and there's progress being made in this direction, is university travel. Because it's not exactly sure how to deal with it, because of a lot of university travel occurs on federal funding or other sources that may not allow this type of expense. But I think that offsetting university travel is something that we can get to very, very rapidly. And it's a meaningful and measurable amount of carbon emissions. And I think there's a lot of things we can also get to very quickly on food procurement and so on. Those are sort of the lowest hanging fruit, but it's not at all clear that we've thought this issue through, which is why we didn't have time and we don't have the mechanisms to do so, which is why we have set up a panel, or we recommend a panel to take this on right away, to really start to estimate and act on it.
Thanks, Steve. This next question, Steve, is for you as well. You mentioned that U of M should be investing in sustainability research. Can you give a few examples of the types of research you have in mind?
Well, for people in the audience, I was Vice President for Research for 8 years. And so I have to say that I perhaps have a somewhat biased opinion on this. And of course, I am a very active researcher myself. But just to give you a couple examples, we have the Global CO2 Initiative under Volker-Sick, which is finding ways to bury carbon, among other things. We have people who are looking at various solar technologies, splitting of hydrogen using solar. That's another large initiative in the College of Engineering. But I think the most important aspect of the research that we do is that it not sit in the lab. And we have a very effective Office of Tech Transfer. And we would hope that the university would strongly engage our researchers with the Office of Tech Transfer to make sure that there are practical outcomes to this that are immediately brought to the public. And I should also say through of course products and through technologies that are implanted are translated from the lab into the rest of the community. I should say that we are not working in a vacuum here. The Department of Energy is very actively funding and supporting all kinds of renewable energy research. It would astound you how many forms of that there are. University of Michigan researchers take advantage of that, but I think as we power up, particularly in this direction, our research to its full capacity, we will be getting tremendous aid from the federal government and from donors to augment our own investment and really go quite beyond it. And that's been our experience at the University of Michigan. When we self-invest in research, big things happen. We're a very powerful research university.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that that in addition to what Steve said around the technology side of things, really important also that research address the social sciences, the policy barriers. What are the other questions that need answering in order to figure out how to get the technology deployed at scale and with the urgency needed to address the problem? And so we have an initial program on carbon neutrality faculty research that President Schlissel has set up, which focuses in part on interdisciplinary research and goes in addition to engineering and the hard sciences into the social sciences and policy. An example would be, we all know how to build at this point utility scale solar and wind installations, but what has to happen on the ground for a community in the Midwest to attract it or to be willing to even have it sited there in terms of the tax benefits to the community, or sharing fairly the revenue from that so that those who want to have it there and those who don't want to have it there both see some benefit in it being there.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm seeing a few questions related to the central power plant and a couple questions related to offsets. I'll pose the central power plant questions kind of all together to Steve and then go to the offsets questions from there. But yeah, seeing a few questions about the central power plant, how it's powered by natural gas. I want to focus on one question that I found particularly interesting, and that's how will electricity be provided to the hospital in the event of a power grid failure similar to the Great Blackout of 2003, if the central power plant was converted to geo-exchange? During the Great Blackout, the central power plant was able to go off grid and supply electricity to the hospital, while the East Coast and Southeast Michigan was without electricity. So Steve, starting with you, what's kind of the contingency planning for this legacy infrastructure? How is the commission thinking about things like that?
Well, of course, the central power plant, let's face it, by our plan, its days are numbered because it generates CO2 emissions. So in our long-term plan, that will be decommissioned. I think, though, the question has more depth than just that piece. It is, how can we be sure in a world of an aging electricity grid, sometimes unstable, now we're placing loads on it from renewable sources that it is unused to, for example, local solar and things. Those are all issues that stretch actually well beyond the borders of the university itself. But I can say that things like geo-exchange and local solar and so on provide a lot of redundancy. But there is still vulnerability to the grid, and we will be purchasing hopefully all renewables from the grid, and that's going to take some upgrading. But we're seeing these changes, and we have research actually again going right here on campus on smart grids and reforming that infrastructure. So I think in the future, those sorts of issues will be somewhat diluted by the number and the diversity of energy sources that will be out there, including, by the way, energy storage. And that is growing very rapidly as a possibility. We've seen big contracts go out to cities like Los Angeles for huge amounts of electrochemical, that is battery storage, to back up their renewable sources. When the wind stops or the sun goes down, you have to have a way of recapturing that energy that you might have generated earlier. So I think that The distribution of sources is going to be very helpful in stabilizing our electricity supply, but you should not be under the illusion that this is going to happen overnight. There's a lot of transformation that has to happen between now and then.
Mm-hmm. I would just add that any system that we go forward with is going to have built-in redundancies and safeguards. Something like being able to supply power to the hospital will be a critical front of mind issue in designing these plans. And whether it's backup generators that are fueled by sustainable biofuels or hydrogen, or by then some other carbon neutral fuel source, I would expect that the university will protect its essential functions in the case of challenges to the electricity supply.
Thanks, Jennifer. I want to pose to you a couple questions about offsets, and I'll try to group them together. First off, I guess this question is for both of you, but we'll start with Jennifer. And the question is, will the offsets committee that Jennifer mentioned be part of the high-placed central office that Steve mentioned? And as an addendum to that, the other questions are, what are some examples of carbon offsets that you are planning to pursue? And who is accountable in matching offsets to the set requirements?
Sure. Good questions. I would say on the first one, the oversight of such a committee strikes me as a logical role for this office reporting to the president and implementing the carbon neutrality recommendations. I'd also expect that this group would be made up of experts inside and probably also outside the university. And so it would be, not just staff under that person, but we also, I think at our peril get too prescriptive about trying to, say the color and length of the drapes in the offices and things like that. But I would expect that that's a logical place for it to be. On the types of offsets that the university might pursue, I think that, again, look to the kind of guidelines that we're putting forward which is perhaps more useful for the kind of offsets we wouldn't pursue. But I think that the criteria that we set forward would discourage the university from going out just to a carbon market that's sometimes described as the Wild West and trying to buy the cheapest ones possible, because this is an area where cost is indicative of integrity sometimes. So I think that would be a factor. A lot of schools have looked for things like projects in the forests in their own state, or Duke University has interesting examples in terms of where they have used it as an educational opportunity to involve students in working with a project developer on some land use activity that generates offsets. But it wouldn't be up to the commission to decide what kind of offsets could be used, but those are some possible examples.
No, I really have nothing to add to that. I think that Jennifer handled it. Most of the major issues. I do believe that we have set out a set of principles. Jennifer has listed them, and we're hoping that those will be the guidance. So our job, actually, if we go beyond offsets, our job really has been to focus on principles on almost every aspect of our recommendations. What are the principles the university should follow? Because again, we're working in an extremely dynamic environment where everything changes every day. The technologies change, the availability of offsets change, the social construct, the government policies we know are going to be in extreme flux in the very near future from what they have been. So it's more important that we, in our recommendations, clarify what the principles are, and no more, in no area is it more important when buying offsets, because you can go from the very serious to, as Jennifer says, the Wild West, and we have to be very cautious about how we do that.
Thank you both. Jennifer, because you mentioned comparable program that you're looking at Duke, I want to pose two questions, starting with you. And it's one, one person asked, it seems like the geo exchange recommendation is a chance for U of M to be a leader, but what other recommendations would be more getting UM caught up to its peers? And as another addendum to that, what other institutions did the commission look to? How was the peer benchmarking process throughout this?
Sure, thank you. I guess on the second question first, I had described the internal analysis teams that we set up with faculty expert leads and students. And the instructions that we gave to each of those groups was, as they developed their recommendations, to survey peer institutions. And so a lot of those reports have appendices that talk about what other institutions they looked at and what other schools are doing. For instance, some of the commuting recommendations, I remember references to what Indiana University is doing with bicycling. The recommendation around an internal carbon price was informed by the positive and negative lessons that Yale is learning through the internal carbon price that they have. Some other institutions have set up renewable energy funds. I believe that the group that developed the recommendation around the revolving energy fund also was looking at, maybe it was Ohio State, one of the other schools that is setting up a fund like that. So without being super specific, there was quite a bit of work in all these recommendation areas of looking at what peers were doing. The consulting firm we hired for the heat and power infrastructure does a lot of work for other large universities and small colleges. And so they were, in their own recommendations to us, informed by their experience at other schools. As far as areas where we are, I guess I personally am not super interested in where we're ahead and where we're behind of our peer institutions. I think all of us right now are really trying to move together as fast as possible toward carbon neutrality. And what I've been gratified by is seeing the levels of collaboration and information sharing that are happening through the groups that we're involved with. We joined the University Climate Change Coalition, UC3. There's an initiative that we've been on the steering committee for, which is the Midwest Climate Summit this past fall, which is evolving into a Midwest Climate Consortium. There are other networks of schools. So, I mean, I've seen it, at least the experience I've been having is more, this is working for us, this is working for you. And I frankly, once the university decides which of these recommendations to adopt, I'm really excited about the scalable and transferable stage of this process where we are taking out to others very actively, here's what's working, here's what's not, you know, and continuing that dialogue to inform our efforts going forward.
Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, right, I absolutely agree with Jennifer that this is not a competition. It's a competition to save the planet, if anything. Mm-hmm. And we're trying very much to share our expertise and to learn from others. So we have done a lot of benchmarking. I should say that a lot of that benchmarking is in the appendices to the draft report and will appear in the final report as well, because our internal analysis teams did a very good job. I think that on the Geo Exchange, Ball State was used as quite an example where they have done some real Geo Exchange implementation. But there is no doubt, as I mentioned, that this would be the largest such project on the planet if we took it on, because the University of Michigan, from an area building perspective, is one of the largest. The Ann Arbor campus is one of the largest, if not the largest, single campus on the planet as well, with a lot of legacy buildings. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned. If we do this, we will become the world's experts in Geo Exchange. So other people can figure out how to do this from our experiences. But I should also keep in mind that Geo Exchange is one of many technologies that could be implemented. It is the most realistic today, but that does not mean in 5 years from now that it will still be the most realistic. So we can do this in stages, which is what we propose. But I also feel that right out of the gate, when we took on all of these scope 1, 2, and 3 categories, that we already put our flag in the ground, saying that we were going to do this to the extent possible. We were going to make this giant 3 campuses carbon neutral. And I don't think anybody has, including the medical system. And I don't think that any other of our peer institutions have gone quite that far. So they're looking with a great deal of interest, I think enthusiasm as well, at what we are proposing. I know that both Jennifer and I, and I'm sure other commissioners, have been directly approached by other universities for how we're doing this. What can they learn from what we're doing? They look at the University of Michigan as a model. We're always a model. That's something that I have learned being at the University of Michigan now for 15 years, that the University of Michigan is really looked at as a very serious institution, that when it says it's going to do something, it generally does it, and it does it well. And so when we make a claim that we're going to be carbon neutral by these mechanisms, using these technologies, people will take that very, very seriously, and they will start modeling their own efforts that way. And this is not just about universities; it's any large-scale institution. And I mean, Ann Arbor is a university town, and the University of Michigan within Ann Arbor is a town in itself. So there's a lot of extensibility here.
Thank you both. It looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so 2 or 3 more questions. And I want to end on one about whether carbon neutrality is an operational problem or a cultural problem. So just get primed for that as a one to end with. But before that, I want to talk about a question that's especially germane because we're all gathering on Zoom to talk about this, and it's on e-commuting. Is the commission recommending incentives, and how would e-commuting factor into kind of our accounting of the problem? On one hand, there's less driving. On the other hand, there's maybe higher heating expenses at home, heating use at home. How is the commission thinking about that? Steve, let's start with you.
Well, my dean at the College of Engineering said that one thing COVID cured in the College of Engineering was our parking shortage. We have managed to pivot quite readily and quite effectively toward a total telecommuting environment. We're lucky, by the way, that COVID, from this perspective, did not happen 5 or 6 years ago, because the electronic tools were even more crude at that time. So again, we're living in a dynamic environment. We have not gone in really enormous depth into the telecommuting challenge, because there's a lot of family issues, there are a lot of preference issues, and some people really prefer it, other people don't, and so on. But the one thing we do know is that telecommuting, like never before, is an option. And one should also, I think the questioner was very astute in saying, well, maybe heating costs, heating will go up. And if my house is not as efficient from a carbon perspective as the university, then am I really saving carbon? Really good question. Another question is, well, people might tend to do more errands during the day and use their cars more than if they came to the university and parked it and clustered their errands for other times. So it isn't an absolute straight line from telecommuting to carbon neutrality. However, it's quite clear that telecommuting is a piece of it. And I think it's going to have, I think I mentioned during the recommendations part, particularly with telecommuting, is one size does not fit all. But I think right now there's a much greater acceptance to this possibility. And I think in the long run, my intuition tells me that it's going to really save carbon quite a bit. And it might save many other things like costs and so on, but it can't be uniformly and universally applied.
Thanks, Steve. I want to ask this next question to Jennifer, and it's about Dearborn. Just with the context that this draft report tries to address a university that operates in 3 distinct campuses and 3 distinct community contexts with differing access to resources and infrastructure. The question is, with U of M Dearborn being a commuter campus, what will specifically be done to address inadequate public and campus transportation?
Mhm. Thank you. That's a great question. And we tried very hard to think about these issues with respect to all 3 campuses as we went through this report, even though each have very distinct factors and communities that they operate in. With respect to being the commuter campus, our recommendations include the extension of universal access transit agreements to all students, faculty, and staff on the Dearborn and the Flint campuses, including accessible bus stops and campus-based routes. We also recommend that the university work with the city of Dearborn to fund and complete bikeways to the Dearborn campus that the city of Dearborn's multimodal plan has proposed. So those are a couple specifics, but I think there are limits to the depth with which the commission can get into detail, specifically campus by campus. So again, referring back to what Steve said about principles and about general expectation that the university will work with the local community to implement recommendations along these lines, we would hope that there would be significant effort put into how to improve public transit for Dearborn students in consultation with the community and with the students.
Thanks, Jennifer. I want to pivot to the last question, and it's a big picture question. And Jennifer, we'll start with you. In your opinion, is carbon neutrality an operational problem or a culture problem that produces operational inefficiencies?
You forgot answer C, which is both. It's both. It's clearly somewhat an operational problem. And you know, at the global scale, we don't see, the experts who study this don't see a way to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 unless we really ramp up ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere that's already there, and to come up with new technologies that more quickly replace fossil fuels. So that's operational. And across the university, that's also going to be the case in terms of how we change our fleet or how we renovate our buildings. But it's absolutely a cultural issue as well, because so many of the kinds of innovations that are needed to reduce our carbon footprint are also to be implemented at the individual level or with the support of individuals. You know, there are studies that show that the greenhouse gas footprint of some building that's done to wonderful LEED standards fall if the people who go into that building don't turn out the lights or leave the windows open in the winter, or the thermostat isn't set at the right level and things like that. So there's got to be a lot of cultural change and education as well. Like in areas like our food recommendations, it's not mandating what people have to eat. It's trying to come out with information and create more options and opportunities for people to move toward a more plant-based diet in a way that is culturally sensitive and positive.
Thanks, Jennifer. Steve, close it out for us.
Well, the one thing that is true and should be clear to everybody, that having worked with Jennifer for 2 years, we think along very parallel lines. So I tend to agree with everything she says. So I think she hit some very important points, but I should also say there's an environmental justice aspect to this, which hits all of us, and it's our cultural issues that underrepresented parts of our society are generally more harshly affected by climate change than other things. So it is a quality of life aspect that I think climate change
attention to climate change will really change local culture and a feeling of equity across our society, which I think is desperately needed and extremely important. I also think that, and of course, it's all of the above, just as Jennifer says, but we can ask people to turn off the lights, and they will, but it's for a while, but they won't pay much attention to it unless the University of Michigan as an organization leads. The way you change culture is for us to do visible things, to say this is a cultural priority, a cultural imperative, so that when we remove carbon emissions from our fleet, our buses, for example, people will immediately recognize that this is important to us as a society. And therefore, they will be more inclined to turn off their lights, to buy more energy efficient appliances, or maybe fewer appliances, or consider better how to manage their own living spaces. So the university must lead in this, and the culture will follow as long as the culture exists in a permanent fashion within the upper levels and all levels of the university itself. So culture is kind of right in the center line of what is important here. The operational things are tactical, if I can say that.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Jennifer. That's such a good way to bookend this. It's carbon neutrality is such a broad charge involving both cultural and operational and tactical components. It involves institutional actions that prompt the community along. It involves individual actions because the university is only as sustainable as the community behind it. So I think it's so important to stress that everybody really does have a role to play in all this, and likewise, we hope and expect for the University of Michigan to lead. Thank you all for joining today for this discussion, and thank you especially to Professor Forrest and Professor Haverkamp for giving us all an overview of carbon neutrality, of the PCCN, and of the draft recommendations to date. Thank you, Steve, for putting up that final slide with the QR codes to the public comment portal and the draft recommendations. Again, the commission encourages everybody to review the draft recommendations and submit public comment portal, submit public comments to the portal, rather. And with that, we encourage you to stay in the loop. We sure will be. And thank you again for attending.
Many thanks.
Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.